Hi there! Welcome to my documentary journey. 50 years of making documentaries. Well, over 50 years actually, and also teaching them. Now I have to confess right off the top that this is not about all sorts of documentaries. No. It's talking about the sort I make and I love. I'm going to be telling you stories about what are called observational films. Sometimes they're called cinema verite. Now this all started for me when I got to Stanford University in the mid-60s from Australia to study filmmaking, and we were seeing in our classes these great films from a place called the National Film Board of Canada, where I later worked, and they were so fresh and new and different. What had happened was that just before that, it had become possible to put the camera, which before was pretty much locked on a tripod, put cameras on the shoulder, hook them up with a cable to a tape recorder, and for the camera crew to wander around and follow people into the most intimate moments in their lives. And the material was strange and startling. Of course, today, everybody's got a camera in their pocket and they're forever pulling them out and filming intimate moments. But that just didn't happen then. So what was happening was so fresh and so fascinating, and all the students in my class, we all wanted to do that. Well, I got to do it. I actually got to work at the National Film Board. And the first film that you're going to see in this series was actually made 50 years ago, and one of the first to use this new freedom. Now, apart from what I've just told you, I'm not going to be talking about technology. What I want to talk about is what I'd call the documentary posture, which is this position that you adopt as a filmmaker, that you're just intensely curious about life, about people, and you want to follow them around. It's a sort of reverential thing in a way. It's very tricky too, because you have to be a good psychologist. Because you have this strange situation where you're asking people to give you big chunks of their lives, to let you into secret places in their hopes and their dreams, and they're going to do that without getting any money for it. You know, when you make a fiction film, people are paid to bring a story to life. But in a documentary, generally speaking, that isn't true. People are giving you stuff for free. But they can decide they don't want to give you that stuff. They can decide that they're fed up with the process. You have to understand what's going on in terms of these people that you've chosen to make a film about. What's in it for them? Why are they cooperating with you? I call it access anxiety when you don't know. You have to know so that you can be alert to any moment when people's feelings are changing about what's happening and when they might pull the plug on you. I mean, imagine you get 6 months into a project, you're doing a portrait of somebody, and suddenly they're not interested anymore. And they say, bye-bye, and there's nothing you can do about it. So a lot of the stories I'm going to be telling is about how I related to people, what I thought they were getting out of the situation that I was filming, and how I had all my antenna up, waiting for and being alert to those dangers that I'm talking about. So in order to illustrate that, I thought I'd tell you a story, because at the end of the day too, it's all about storytelling. Documentaries love stories, need stories just as much as fiction films do, but they're different sort of stories. They're more tenuous, more ephemeral, more loose, and when you see a story thread, you have to nurture it very carefully, or it might just disappear on you. Anyway, so here goes a story about me and the documentary process. One night, it would have been in the mid-1980s, I was driving back from Montreal, where I lived, to Harvard, Boston, where I was teaching. And it was a late and lonely late-night drive along an alpine freeway, very remote, very little traffic, but usually it went quite well, and I thought that this night I would be able to make it without stopping. But I got about halfway along and I realized that I was beginning to nod off. And this was not a road to stop on. So I started looking down away from the highway down at little towns that I was passing, and there weren't many of them. They were all asleep, not a light anywhere. I was getting desperate, and at last I saw a blaze of light. Just caught the exit, wound my way down through this town, and found that there was a Dunkin' Donuts open. Big cars nosing in towards the glass. So I went in for coffee, and you know that scene in the first Star Wars movie when Luke Skywalker goes into the cantina and all these creatures, and one of them says to him, "My friend doesn't like you, and I don't like you either." It felt a little bit like that. There were all these men lined up at a counter. Nothing was happening, but they all turned around to look at me, and there was a girl pouring the coffee, and there was a sense that they were waiting for something. And indeed they were, because by the time I got sat down at this counter squeezed between two enormous guys, they were not truck drivers, by the way, they were insomniacs from a little town. The time I got sat down there, this guy burst through the doors. He was the cook. He was covered in flour, had greasy black hair, big mole in his cheek, and he came out performing. He was an Elvis impersonator, and everybody had been waiting for this. Yay, go Donnie, go Donnie. And this guy is prancing up and down behind the counter with his air guitar and singing, "You ain't nothing but a hound dog," and "Love me tender, love me true." The girl was not too happy about it, but she kept on pouring the coffee, and obviously this happened quite a lot. He was famous, and they were clapping, everybody loved it, and some. I'm thinking, what a scene, only in America. It's fantastic. And then he stops and he says, "I gotta go, gotta make some donuts." And he disappears through the door. Now I'd been thinking, I have a camera in the car. I could go get it and film this because he's coming back. But on the other hand, as I say, the atmosphere was very, very tense, not friendly at all. I was an outsider. They were still looking at me like this. The girl wasn't very happy, and I was very much hesitating. I didn't think of it at the time, but when I used this tape later, teaching my students, I would talk about other filmmakers and their feelings about such situations. Don Pennebaker, for instance, who made Don't Look Back about Bob Dylan, Monterey Pop, The War Room, fantastic filmmaker. He told me that when he started off, he would go in New York along a certain street. It would have to be a street he didn't know, and he would go along the street, and he would go into bar after bar, and he would take photographs with a camera just to see how it felt to intrude on people's sort of private spaces and whether he could handle it, So I would tell the students about that as I'm sitting there in the Dunkin' Donuts wondering what to do. And then there was Nick Broomfield, a wonderful filmmaker who's made so many films. The one I like best actually is an early film called Chicken Ranch about a Nevada brothel. Anyway, I interviewed Nick, and he told me that he always worked with a woman camera person. Sandy Sissel in the case of Chicken Ranch. What he found was that this combination of the two sexes covered all the bases, and you had all those antennae out as to what might go wrong, how people were taking you. So that was his approach to these sort of interventionist situations. And then lastly, there was a crazy, amazing couple called Jeff Krynes and Joel DeMott, who made a film called Demon Lover Diary, and another one called 17. Joel, who was the woman in the team, said that they never went anywhere without their camera. In other words, in this situation, they wouldn't have come into the Dunkin' Donuts without their camera, and they would have put it there in the thing, so there was no question of going to get something, of surprising anybody, It was them and their camera, or not them and their not camera. So anyway, I'm sitting there thinking these things and thinking, I've got that camera in the car. Do I really want to do this? I'm also thinking, though, but this is a great teaching tool perhaps for tomorrow. So I go out to the car and I get the whole rig together, hook it up and everything, and I'm maybe half wondering whether I will go back in. But I do, and I find he's come back out and he's started up again. And he looks at me in this rig and he goes, "Oh, no." And all the other people go, "No." This was the days when, cameras were sort of threatening and people didn't like them very much. Anyway, so I put the camera down then. And so he's doing his thing. And then he says, "Hey, come on." So he's inviting me to pick up, and I start shooting, and he gets better because the camera actually energizes a situation. It excites a situation. Anyway, so it goes on for a bit. I get a couple of numbers. By this time the crowd is appreciating that he's appreciating me shooting it all, and the whole atmosphere has become terrific. And then he's getting very bold. He lifts a flap in the counter and he's saying, "Come." He takes me, I get drawn back into the back, and there's a big sort of flowery table where he makes the donuts. I don't think a machine made them. I think he was actually hand making the donuts and popping them into boiling fat or something. Anyway, with an evil glint in his eye, he starts making these sort of obscene things out of dildo and flaccid penises and so on, and I'm sort of coming down to a close-up of this and thinking, wow, this is weird, And then suddenly the girl has come in through the door and she knocks the camera from my shoulder and she says, "Get the fuck out of here," which I do through the back door. And I'm back on the road pretty quick, very awake, with an amazing tape. And when I showed it the next day in class, what I was talking about was, look, we documentary filmmakers, we're drawn into strange situations, and I saw this as a fascinating situation. I wasn't going to make a long film about it. I wasn't going to follow this guy into his career when he went off to New York to become Donald and the Donuts with a band. I wasn't going to do that. But it was a magic moment. But I hadn't been aware of the vibe. Well, I was aware of the vibe that I wasn't welcome, but I thought I'd got over that. And I wasn't aware, though, of how this would be threatening for the girl who worked there. She was obviously thinking that, if this got out, if it became public, they might lose their jobs, I hadn't thought of that at all. So I lost the access. And I always used this later, this little incident, to a way of talking about how you have to be so careful about when you get access to people's lives to understand what's in it for them, why they may allow this to be happening. Of course, in his case, once he'd gone over his initial antagonism towards me for being the stranger in the night, once he'd got over that, he was so happy. But she wasn't. There was nothing in it for her. And I was not tuned into that at all. So it was a terrific lesson to learn. And I'm going to finish this introductory talk with the other thing that came out of this. And that is, okay, you want to get into life, but into what part of the river of life do you jump, Why would you go into this part of the river and not that part of the river? So I actually, in another teaching situation, years later, developed a checklist, which turned out for me to be very useful. So useful, not only for students, but for myself, and I used it again and again with good results. Basically, it was 6 points, and the first one is, what's at stake? Well, in the case of Dunkin' Donuts, not much at stake. I wasn't going to follow this guy's life, as I said, just a moment in the night. But you need to have something at stake in a longer form way in a good documentary. So that's number one. Number two is related to that, story. As I said, documentaries need and love stories just as much as fiction films, but they're more ephemeral. I mean, I could have picked up on her story if I'd been more sensitive and I'd wanted to stick around, life in a country town, what it was like, and, the things that she was thinking. You need a story thread, and you'll see in my course how I find a thread and I nurture it. I'm waiting for the next appearance of that thread that I can pick up and build upon it in an observational way. I'm not creating things happening, but I'm alert to the thread and its possibility of re-emergence. And number three is character. I mean, everybody is potentially interesting, but some people the camera loves. Some people, just have a certain charisma. He certainly had that, He was a good performer. There could have been a film following him to wherever he was going. Now, the fourth one is always, well, not always, but very often forgotten. And that is all of this touching? Does it touch the emotions? That tends to get forgotten because documentaries often are a very serious matter about some serious subject and so on. And the emotions of the characters may not be celebrated or really, observed with the tenderness and the closeness that they need. In this case, she was a touching character, this young woman, and if I'd paid more attention to her, I might have got something out of it. I might have even gone back in and been able to talk to her about how she was feeling, promising her perhaps that the material would never be released, which it wasn't. It was only used in classes. So touching is very important, that there be a touching element to your story. The fifth is what I call the big picture. Because usually in the case of a documentary, there's something larger at stake. It's about culture, small town life, perhaps in this case. And that overhangs all the intimate personal stuff that you're getting. All my films do have a big picture element. I go to Cuba to explore Cuban-American relationships. I went to Vietnam to find out what the Vietnam War was all about. But what I find is that I'm much more interested in human foibles, in idiosyncrasies, rather than exploring issues and proving points. So that I go to Cuba and I explore character and I tell stories. And the same thing in Vietnam. It's something to do with my personal way of viewing life, I guess, that I just love human foibles and contradictions and eccentricities, paradoxes, more than I love making an argument. I did make a film. You will see a film that I made about whether or not Shakespeare actually wrote his plays. And I make a very good case that in fact it was Christopher Marlowe who did so. But you'll see that my film is equally interested in character, the eccentric people who promote this theory. And the last thing was a bit of a joke in a way. I used to say to the students, all of this must wrap up to something strangely compelling. You perhaps don't know what it is, but you sure know it when you see it. And the Dunkin' Donuts story, the tape that I had was strangely compelling, and I used it year after year until I lent it to somebody foolishly without making a copy, and it got lost. Anyway, so that gives you an idea of my approach and the way I'm going to be telling stories about the films I made. They're not the most famous documentaries in the world, but I will talk about them with great candor, admitting my mistakes, and I'm hoping that because this element of documentary is timeless, it's not about equipment or anything like that, the same problems I faced back 50 years ago making my first documentary are the problems that you will face today. So it remains eternally and forever relevant, this business of the psychology of your posture, the way you position yourself in terms of life. Well, I hope you found that interesting enough to go to the next lesson, which is behind a modest paywall, which my daughter, Ellen, who's behind the camera there and is producing this, really insists that we put. She says, Dad, look, people don't appreciate things unless they pay for them. I guess that's true. Anyway, I have to thank Ellen a lot because I never would have done this if it wasn't for her. She said, it doesn't matter if it doesn't work, Dad. It'll be an archive for me, when you're gone. Yeah, when you're gone. I'm 81 years old. When you're gone, She said it'll be something we'll have to remember you. So thank you, Ellen, for pushing me into this. And I hope to see you all after the break behind the paywall. Oh, I nearly forgot. I have to thank Jeff Crines for the great stills he provided, and especially Nick Broomfield for the great stills that he provided. Here's Nick today with Joan Churchill, with whom he co-directed so many documentaries, great documentaries. Anyway, lists for Nick, for Jeff and Joel, and also for Don Pennybaker, who sadly recently died, are here for you to explore.